All right, good morning. We'll go ahead and get started. I am happy to see those of us that are here that are out. It's a dreary day, and we're got a lot of people traveling, a lot of people working. So we're kind of a close bunch today. We'll just go ahead and get started with a prayer before we get into class, and I've asked Tim if he'll lead us in that.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for the blessings of this day. Thank you for the rain that you sent our way and for the brief respite that will give us the heat. Thank you, Father, for the ability to meet together, to study your word, and ask that you be with Kevin this morning as he directs our study of Nehemiah. We are mindful, Father, of the large number of our family here who are away at camp, traveling this week, and we pray for their safety, we pray for their spiritual growth during camp. Thank you, Father, for this group of people, and ask that you continue to watch over us, bless us, and help us to be at peace. Father, we're always, most especially for your Son, Jesus. In his name we thank you.
Amen. Okay. So this morning we'll be covering Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 19 through chapter 4, verses 23. So this is, I think, so far this is the biggest chunk of Nehemiah that we've covered. If you've read ahead at all, then you'll have noticed that chapter 3 is pretty much just all lists of the different families that are helping out building the wall. And so most of our focus this morning will be on those last couple verses of chapter 2 that we didn't cover last Sunday, and then we'll be looking more at chapter 4. That said, I do want to address some of chapter 3. We're just going to kind of do it in not exactly the order that it's presented in. So to get us started off with, I think it'd probably just be a good idea if we read our text. We're going to skip chapter 3 for the reading, and then I'll just, when we talk about it, I'll refer to it. So can I get a reader to start us off? I got ahead of myself. So this is what we talked about last time. So a quick recap of last Sunday was discussing Nehemiah's conversation that he has with Artaxerxes. So chapter 1, Nehemiah finds out that Jerusalem, and specifically the wall, is in rubble, and then Nehemiah has a very impassioned prayer in chapter 1, asking God to help him as he prepares to speak to the king. Chapter 2 was Nehemiah addressing the king and then preparing to leave on his journey to Jerusalem, and then ultimately getting to Jerusalem, and he begins the initial phases of his plan, and he inspects the wall. And so that leads us up to today, where we're going to be addressing as Nehemiah begins that process of rebuilding the wall, he starts facing the opposition from the local population that's there, and we're going to look at how he deals with that opposition, how he faces adversity as he's trying to accomplish this mission that God's given him. So I'm going to ask somebody if they would read, starting in verse 19 of chapter 2, and then read those last couple verses in chapter 2, and then we're not going to read chapter 3, but then we'll jump to chapter 4, and I'll just ask for 2 readers, one person to read chapter 2, 19 and 20, and then flip over to chapter 4 and read chapter 4, 1 through 14, and then a second reader to read chapter 4, 15 to the end of the chapter. Good. Jacob, we'll have you go first, and then Adam, you can take the second one.
When Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, Geshem the heir, heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is that you are doing, they asked. Are you rebelling against the king? I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We
Yes, please.
When our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had frustrated their plan, we all returned to the wall, each to his work. From that day on, half of my servants worked on construction and half held the spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. And the leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah, who were building on the wall. Those who carried burdens were loaded in such a way that each labored on the work with one hand and held his weapon in the other. And each of the builders had his sword strapped at his side while he built. The man who surrounded the trumpet was beside me. And I said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, the work is great and widely spread, and we are separated on the wall, far from one another. In the place where you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. So we labored at the wall, and half of them held the spears from the break of dawn until the stars came out. I also said to the people at that time, let every man and his servant pass the night within Jerusalem, that they may be a guard for us by night and may labor by day. So neither I nor my brothers nor my servants nor the men of the guard who followed me, none of us took off our clothes. Each kept his weapon at his right hand.
Excellent. All right. So this is really the most exciting part of Nehemiah that we've gotten to so far. This is what it's been building up to. And you get some kind of humorous insults that the locals are throwing at the Jews trying to build the wall. It kind of sounds like schoolyard insults to me. And but you get that quickly turns to threats and wanting to violently prevent the reconstruction of the wall. And you have the Jews who are building taking on the daunting task of you're trying to build the wall, which is hard labor, and at the same time you're doing that, you've got a weapon in your other hand, and you're constantly checking over your shoulder to make sure that nobody's ambushing you and trying to prevent your work. So regarding the reading that we've done, I wanted to consider these three questions. And the first one we'll address is why were Sanballat and Tobiah so opposed to the wall being built? And so what I'd like for us to do is try to put ourselves in the historical context as though we are Sanballat and Tobiah. And I want to ask you, why do you think they were so vehemently opposed to this that they started out with those jeering, those insults, and when that didn't work, then they start talking about, well, let's kill these people that are going to build the wall? Because that's a very extreme development for them, and so that you are that impassioned about it that you're going to say, I'm going to kill these people that want to build the wall. So asking you then, as Tobiah and Sanballat, why do you think that was the case?
I think it probably started out as without the wall, they were mostly defenseless, so they were easy to be dominated. So it's probably easy to assume that they were. I almost think of like a mafia type situation where they were extorting the people, and so they're if there's a wall, it's much harder for them to do that. And there's also the historical context of the enmity between the people. And if the wall is rebuilt, it means more and more Jews might return, and their position might continue to be weakened.
Excellent. Before I throw my 2 cents in, anybody else have wanted to something else they'd thought about? Yeah, so Jacob's comment really covered a lot of it. The historical context is just as the Jews had been taken from their homeland and displaced to another homeland, to replace that missing population, the conquering armies and nations then grabbed other peoples from other places, moved them to Israel, and they just kind of shift people around. And so by shifting those populations, they've weakened those societies. But you didn't have to just completely annihilate everyone. And so that's why you have all these people. You have Arabs and Ammonites, and you get all these different lists of people as we're reading through Nehemiah. And that's why they're all here, is because they were displaced too. Their homelands were conquered, and they were brought in to fill the missing population as the Jews left. So we're getting this conflict that now Jews are coming back, and they want to fix up their home. They want to fix up Jerusalem. And your mafia comparison, Jacob, kind of is fitting because they're the ones that were in power. They had all the power. And we're going to jump ahead a little bit in Nehemiah, but can I get somebody to read chapter 6, verses 17 through 19? And then somebody else read 13, 4 and 5, and then verse 28.
Chapter 6, verses 17.
17 through 19.
Also in those days, the nobles of Judah were sending many letters to Tobiah, and replies from Tobiah kept coming to them. For many in Judah were under oath to him, since he was son-in-law to Shechaniah, son of Ara, and his son Jehonan, and married the daughter of Meshullam, son of Bechiah. Moreover, they kept reporting to me his good deeds, and then telling him what I said. Tobiah sent letters to intimidate me.
Great. And then somebody else, 13, verses 4 through 5, and then jump to 28.
Now before this, Elisha the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah, prepared for Tobiah a large chamber, where they had previously put the grain offering, the frankincense, the vessels, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil, which were given by commandment to the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king, and after some time I asked leave of the king. 13, 4, 5.
And then verse 28, if you would.
And one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Elisha, the high priest, was the son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. Therefore I chased him from me.
All right, thank you, guys. I know there's a lot of names that we're not familiar with in Nehemiah, and and that's tricky because we kind of zone out when we start reading names, and we're struggling to pronounce them. With that said, though, there's a lot of these names are recurring, and it's helpful to us to track some of these throughout Nehemiah. And so the main ones that we wanted to talk about were Sanballat and Tobiah. Did you pick up on anything going along the lines of discussion of why would Sanballat and Tobiah specifically be so opposed to the wall, and why were they giving so much trouble? What did you see in those verses that we just read from chapter 6 and chapter 13?
Not sure if this is answering your question specifically, but he was not only dealing with external enemies, but he was dealing with internal enemies as well. He was being undermined by his own people, and not just the normal people, the nobles, the priests, the people who should have had his back.
That's excellent. That wasn't exactly what I was looking for, but that hits on a major theme that is important for us to understand what Nehemiah is facing, that he's not just facing these people that are from foreign countries that are living here. They've become friends with a lot of the Jews that are in Jerusalem that were already back. And so that's what we're seeing in those verses that we read. They've Tobiah specifically, he's married into other Jewish families. So he's relatives with them. And in chapter 6, he's on such good terms with them that some of the Jews are going back to Nehemiah and saying, whoa, 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 Tobiah's a great guy. Look at all the great things that he's done. And then Sanballat, one of the names that we read that's really important for us to follow through here is Eliashib. Eliashib is the high priest at the time. And Sanballat has married into Eliashib's family, which is not something that the Jews weren't supposed to be marrying into non-Jewish families. But even setting that aside, creating this huge conflict of interest. And so when Nehemiah comes back to Jerusalem and he wants to build the wall, he's now facing opposition from within and from without. That they want to, the Jews that are parts of these families of Tobiah and Sanballat, they want to support those people. Tobiah and Sanballat have a lot of power that you see being wielded throughout the rest of Nehemiah, and going back to that original point, they don't want to give that up. They're the big dogs, and they don't want to have Nehemiah come in and change that around on them. Yeah.
So Tobiah has some kind of status with the people.
Yes.
And so how would that be lost by building the wall? I might have missed enough by being a nursery.
No, sure. And this is going to get back. I wanted to address this a little bit later, but let's go back to some of the previous classes where we talked about what the purpose of the wall is. There's a physical purpose of the wall that is for security and protection from outsiders. But as we're reading Nehemiah, we also need to look at the symbolic meaning of the wall. And so you get that right at the beginning from this class, those first couple of verses where they, in chapter 2, verses 19 and 20, is that first time you see Sanballat and Ammonite, they jeer at Nehemiah and his group. And Nehemiah's response in verse 20 is, "The God of heaven will make us prosper, and we his servants will arise and build, but you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem." So the wall is both a physical barrier, but it's also a symbolic barrier that you're now cutting out and separating yourself from these people. So they're building this wall, bringing Jews into Jerusalem, forcing everybody out who's not Jewish out of Jerusalem and cutting them off. And Nehemiah is upsetting that balance of power because Tobiah and Sanballat were calling the shots. Now Nehemiah comes in and he says, "I'm calling the shots. I have the authority of Artaxerxes, and I'm stepping in and telling the high priest and the Jews that they need to step up and fill the role that God has called them to fill." That the high priest isn't doing that. He's kind of stepped aside and he's letting these other people take the leadership role. Did that help clarify? Okay, good. Okay, so now chapter 3. That's actually a good segue into chapter 3. We didn't read it because there's lots and lots of names. And I don't know how well you can see. This is a map of Jerusalem. It's not the same map Adam's been using. But this one attempts to illustrate all of those names that you read through chapter 3. This breaks out where geographically on the wall those families were working. It has the gates, because you'll read through chapter 3 and you see so-and-so helped fix the gates, so-and-so fixed the wall that was next to them, and so on and so on. And all of chapter 3, you trace it through, it starts it'll be your left side, verses 1 through 3 is where chapter 3 starts. And those families, and it loops all the way around the wall from there. It goes down the wall and loops all the way back around. And so you have that visual reference. I was hopefully that'll help you. And I'm happy to share this slide if you'd like to refer to it later. I wanted to make some comments about chapter 3. part of it is an aside a little bit about some of the names. A lot of times when we hit genealogies or chapters like this one and we just have lists of names, it's hard for us to find what the meaning is, what's the lesson that we're supposed to get out of that. And I don't have the answer for all of that. I don't know what all the lessons are. But there's a big part of me that I fully believe that God gave us his word and that it all has meaning. And so I want to be really careful about just discounting parts of it that I'm uncomfortable with, because it's hard to say the names and I don't immediately see what the lesson is that's there for us. That being said, with chapter 3, I do want to make some comments that will hopefully be lessons. I don't know that that's all that there is for us to get out of it, but it is something. The first thing I wanted to point out was that everyone helped. If you look at chapter 3, the first verse, then Eliashib the high priest rose up with his brothers. Well, we just read about that Eliashib has let these foreigners marry into his family. But Nehemiah has come in, and through his leadership, he's influenced them, and now Eliashib is stepping up. He's the first name that we're given that's standing up and saying, we're going to help build the wall. So Eliashib brings his whole family, all of the priests in to help build. And that's thematically a major part of chapter 3, because as you go through it, you see the high priest, you see priests, you see goldsmiths, perfumers. It lists a bunch of people who live in cities outside of Jerusalem. So a lot of the people building the wall are not people who live physically inside the walls. They live in surrounding villages and surrounding towns. And they hear the call to come help build the wall, and they come in and commit to building. You see one of the people, it says that he and his daughters, so it sounds like he doesn't have any sons, so he brings his daughters to do it. There's a family called the Tekoites. In verses 5 and verse 27, they actually build 2 separate sections of wall, and they're like on opposite sides of the city. So they were so committed, they came in, they build one section of wall, they finished that, and they're like, we're going to go around, there's this other side of the wall that needs work on it, and we're going to work on that. It also says that in verse 5 that the nobles, the leaders of the Tekoites, didn't participate. And so the Tekoites as a people said, we're going to ignore the disdain of our leaders, and we're going to do this thing because we know that it's right. In verse 5, that says that the nobles would not stoop to serve the Lord. If we think about that in the reverse, though, what that indicates is everyone else was willing to stoop to serve the Lord. So the act of building the wall was serving the Lord. I think that's important for us to think about, that a lot of the work that we do, we need to think about it as an act of service to God. When we change it from, this is just my physical job, I'm a stonemason, I'm building this wall, but we approach it as, I'm going to serve the Lord in doing this, it really changes the purpose and intent of what we're doing. And when we approach it in a sense of, I'm submitting, I'm humbling myself and lowering myself to do these acts of service, then the value and our connection to God is just so much more enhanced than it would have been. So, kind of recap, and I'll summarize what I just said. Everyone chipped in. It didn't matter who you were. It didn't matter that it wasn't your wall, that you live outside the city. It didn't matter that none of these people were stonemasons. None of these people were professional builders of walls. You had goldsmiths. You had perfumers. These are people that they're wealthy merchants. Those are profitable jobs. And they stepped aside from their jobs that were making them lots of money to do something that wasn't making them any money. You had families, they didn't say, I don't have sons, I don't have a bunch of people that can help build the wall. Well, he got his daughters and led them into building the wall. So as we look at God and our service to him as kind of like building the wall, these people didn't make excuses for why they weren't prepared or why they shouldn't be building the wall. They set those things aside and stooped to serve the Lord. And I think that's a really powerful lesson for us to consider in this chapter that's just full of a bunch of names that we maybe don't want to read. Okay. So looking again now at chapter 2 and into chapter 2 and chapter 4. What are some of the different ways you saw that the Jews as a whole responded to the opposition from these other peoples, both the insults and the jeering, and then once that escalated to potential violence, what ways did they respond to that? Yeah. Yeah, so that's important. They kind of divided their roles, but they agreed upon it. And again, and you can kind of refer back to chapter 3. They were unified in their work. They came together, even to the extent, again, of bringing people from outside the wall in to help. What were some other ways they responded?
I kind of get the sense that they took the jeering and the insults and they say, okay, watch this. We are going to build a wall. And when a fox jumps up on a wall, it's not going to fall over.
Yeah.
We're going to make it awesome and we're going to make it quick. And we're going to do it so you can attack us while we're building. So I think, I kind of pick up on this, and it might not be correct at all, but they kind of took that insults and were like, no, we're going to do it because we are the Jews and we have God on our side.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to look at it. That's kind of what Nehemiah says in chapter 2, verse 20. He says, the God of heaven is going to make us prosper, and we, his servants, we're going to arise and build, but you have no claim. Jonathan, go ahead.
I mean, I might be a little allegorical with this, but, when they get the taunts, they say, you don't have any claim or right to this land. And I sort of think about how maybe that applies to the church is, a lot of what we see on Facebook seems to be weaponized by people who don't have any faith against what people of faith do. And a lot of times it's easy to hate on the church and say, well, maybe they've got a valid complaint, but also I don't think we need to let people who don't have any claim to the faith just come here and tear us down. They're not invested in this. They're not invested in faith like we are. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
We don't need to let people just mocking us get in and start dividing us and say, yeah, well, maybe we should fight about this, or maybe we should take up this issue and stop what we're doing and pay attention to this. It's, not that people can't have valid criticism of the church, just a lot of times it's more malicious than it is.
Yes, yeah.
Realistic.
No, outstanding. So that's one of the big overall ways that we need to be reading Nehemiah is, what was it like to be Tobiah and Sanballat? What was it like to be the Jews? But then what you just did, and you said, okay, what's the symbolic meaning? You use the word allegorical. But what does this mean for me? And you're completely correct in saying that using what Nehemiah says here and looking at it as, I don't need to listen to the jeers and insults and let that destroy us and tear us down and hinder our work for the Lord, because the world doesn't have a portion right now. Now, different from Nehemiah, in a way that Christ is superior to what we read in Nehemiah, is that now Christ is trying to bring in the outsiders, And I think that that'll probably be something that we talk some more about later in Nehemiah. But there is the sense that the outside doesn't have a portion with us, and they shouldn't be the ones dictating how we behave. We shouldn't be allowing them to stop our work and service to God. Jim?
One thing I noticed there, and I don't know, maybe somebody brought this up, and I missed that, but another big point is that instead of attempting to handle it themselves, the first thing they did is they went to God about it.
Excellent. Okay, yeah. So, and that's the big one. Yeah.
That was the big thing.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm super glad you brought that up. Let's see. Chapter 4, verse 4. Well, going back to chapter 2, verse 20, Nehemiah immediately in his statement attributes God in it. So he's already looking towards what God's saying. Chapter 4, verse 4, they offer a prayer that God will overcome the opposition. Verse 9, they pray for protection. And then verse 16 and 18 and 19, I think, are all, again, they look to God, and it's all pointing back to God. God will fight for us. God will protect us. God will overcome the opposition. So all throughout this chapter, and we can even go back and tie in chapters 1 and chapters 2, where from the very start, Nehemiah has been praying nonstop. He prays before he sees Artaxerxes. He's talking to Artaxerxes, and he says a prayer, just right there in his head real quick. And that's continuing on as we're going through, that he's always looking to God. And Adam made the point, I think, last time, that, who's the hero of Nehemiah? It's not Nehemiah. There's examples that we can learn from, but ultimately it's God that's bringing this success. And I love that that's constantly being hit on through Nehemiah. Like every time something comes up, they pray and they look to God. So definitely the way, a good example for us to learn of how to deal with opposition is pray to God. And you see examples of the types of prayers that we can offer. Just real quick, some of the other things, the way I broke it down, chapter 2, verse 20, Nehemiah acknowledged the opposition, he addressed it. Chapter 3, everybody came together, they worked together. Chapter 4, we see prayer that we hit on. A negative aspect of how the Jews responded, was in chapter 4, verse 12. Some of the Jews that were friends with Tobiah and Sanballat, they came in and it says, he said 10 times, leave and go home, stop the work. And so there's that internal opposition again. But that is one way that we can respond, is to give up and quit. And that's not what we're supposed to do. But that is an example of what we see happen. Some of the Jews fall into that pit. Chapter 4, verse 16, you see an example of leadership and standing with the people. So it wasn't just the people coming together. You had the leaders that were behind the people. Their full support was there. They were part of the danger, part of the labor. And the end of chapter 4, they fight together. And then verses 21 through 23, So earlier in verse 12, there was the Jews saying, everybody return, go back to your homes, give up the work. And instead, the end of the chapter, you see Nehemiah says to the people at the time, let every man and his servant pass the night within Jerusalem, that they may be a guard for us by night and may labor by day. So neither I nor my brothers, nor my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me, none of us took off our clothes. Each kept his weapon at his right hand. So instead of leaving Jerusalem and going back to your homes outside the city, everybody stayed together. They were all on the same team. They were all part of the same group, and they were fully committed and prepared to face the opposition. We've already hit on a lot of the stuff that I had, a lot of the lessons that we can learn from this opposition and adversity naturally came up as we were talking about it. Want to make sure I'm not missing something that I had. Okay. So before we wrap up, I wanted to kind of tie in some of the other stuff that we've been talking about over the last several months at Ellisville. Ryan's been doing a series of sermons about Genesis chapter 1, and one of the things he keeps coming back to is the idea that, kind of everything we need to know in the Bible happens in the beginning of Genesis, so that it's that foundational framework for how we understand the rest of the Bible. In Genesis chapter 1, he's talked a lot about how God separates the light and the dark. He separates water and land, and there's all this division, and he's setting things in order, things that were just chaos and a mess. He separated and made into good things. And so I saw that, I wanted to bring that into Nehemiah and the wall. That coming in building the wall, Nehemiah shows up at Jerusalem, and it's just a disaster. It's literally in ruins, and holes in the wall, everything's torn down. And one of the lessons I wanted to bring to that is, just as God sets things in order in Genesis, God is working through Nehemiah to come in and set things in order in Jerusalem. And then kind of tying back into some of what Jonathan was saying earlier, applying that to ourselves and this metaphorical, the symbolic wall, we need to fix our own houses, we fix our own lives, we fix our families, we work with the church, and we keep branching out and expanding outside. Building those walls and setting that order for ourselves, we're separating ourselves as God's people from the world. That doesn't mean that we don't interact with and that we're not trying to convert. And that's not the lesson that I want us to pull from this. But the lesson that I do want us to take in is we need to build up and set in order our own lives. And that's an example that we see in Nehemiah. I have the reference for Matthew chapter 12. That's Jesus telling the parable about the demons leaving the house, and they come in and they sweep the house and they clean it up, but they don't fill it back up with anything. And then the demon asks more of his friends, and they come back and they just destroy the house again. And so you see a literal representation of that in Nehemiah, of they're coming in, they're fixing that house, and they're cleaning up and setting things in order, but then they're going to fill it and replace it with good things. And so the last thing I want to leave us with is tying back again into who is the hero of Nehemiah. And I think that as you're reading through Nehemiah, as we're going through it this quarter, constantly be on the lookout for how God is the one that is bringing success. He was constantly showing up throughout the chapters we read this morning, and those things are directly applicable to our lives, that we can ask and should be praying that God will fight for us, that he will overcome the opposition we face. Our opposition is often the sins that we struggle with, our internal struggles, the trials we face. Stuart talked about facing trials Wednesday during the invitation, and some of them they're not inherently spiritual things, but they're things that are trying to distract us from God, and they're challenging us, and we can turn those things into ways to glorify and serve God, and works for God when we redirect our focus back to him and look to him to be the one who will protect us and help us and lead us to overcoming those difficulties. And so that's what I'd like to leave you with, to take with you as application in our own lives, but also to be continuing to look for these things as we continue in Nehemiah. Any last thoughts? All right, thank you.